Hello, this is the Green Report, Rappler's show on the environment and the stories of people whose decisions impact the world around us. I'm Gozum.
And I'm Geronimo.
At may nagbabalik sa Rappler Newsroom, Lian Buan! Yes!
Hi, thanks for having me.
Lian has been covering the Justice Beat for Rappler since 2017. She's now back after a year from the United Kingdom after taking up Master of Laws in Human Rights as a Shivning Scholar. So Lian, kamusta naman ang unang linggo mo sa Pilipinas?
Okay naman, and I'm really excited when you guys told me, gusto mong mag-climate justice topic sa Green Report. I'm like, yeah, sure. Let's put our learnings to good use.
Yeah. So for this Green Report episode, we're talking to Lian about the climate crisis, the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference in the context of international law.
So, siguro, simulan natin yung discussion na prior to your postgraduate studies, bago ka umalis for the UK, ano yung understanding and appreciation mo of climate change and all those talks, discussions?
I think my entry point to climate change is the same entry point for most Filipinos, which is that ang daming bagyo, ang daming sakuna, at tayo yung biktima ng result of global warming because there are more storms. I think that's the entry point understanding of everyone. And then I remember I was doing a climate justice topic for my podcast before, tas ang nakausap ko ay yung Commission of Human Rights. At doon nga nila ina-explain na ang hirap talagang kumuha ng accountability for climate justice because it exceeds territories and jurisdictions eh. Kasi yung nararamdaman natin sa Pilipinas is not even our fault. So, how do you hold accountable someone who is not under your jurisdiction?
Right. So, nung nagtitake ka ng postgrad studies mo, you had a class na about climate change law.
Yes.
Tama. So, you also had a parang final paper na shinare mo sa amin. Baka pwede mo rin i-share sa listeners and viewers kung ano yung subject ng paper na yon.
Sure. So one of the modules we had to take for the Human Rights Program is, yung whole title niya is Tackling Climate Change and Legal Responses, aka Climate Change Law. And I wrote a paper about how there were shortcomings or what are the fundamental flaws of the climate regime being bottom-up approach. Ibig sabihin, yung mga bansa yung nagsasabi ng ito yung obligation namin, tapos itatransmit lang nila pataas. And that's a shift from a top-down approach na yung nasa taas yung nagsasabi na, oh, this should be your obligations and your contributions, tapos gagawin nyo. So, that's the topic.
Yeah, pero sabi mo dun sa paper, problematic yung bottom-up approach. Paano siya naging problematic?
Siguro let's start with the problem inherently of international law. Kasi yung international law, it works only on consent. So, walang magagawang treaty, pact, or agreement kung hindi nag-agree yung mga bansa. So, kailangan kunin mo yung consent. One of the celebrated agreements in the climate change regime is the Kyoto Agreement. Pero researchers say it failed from the start kasi top-down approach siya, and we can remember that the US did not accede to the Kyoto Agreement and only developing countries really entered into the treaty. So may treaty ka nga, wala naman yung mga major emitters and rich countries like the US. So that's the fundamental flaw of international law, and that's why when they met in Paris in 2015, the stakeholders said, maybe let's do it bottom up. Kasi pag binigay natin yung power to dictate their contributions and their obligations, many countries will accede to the agreement. And that's what happened. For the first time ever, all 195 countries signed to the agreement. It's the most ambitious of all. Up until now, it's still the basis of our climate change regime. So, on the one hand, okay, it's worth celebrating. But on the other hand, because you let the countries dictate kung ano yung gusto nilang iambag sa tackling climate change, sobrang baba ng ambition because mahal naman talaga kasing labanan ang climate change and global warming. So when you let the countries say what they want to contribute, the ambition is super, super low. So low that immediately after signing the agreement, yung projections, magfe-fail na. As in, hindi na mamimit yung 2 degrees and more so the 1.5 degrees aspiration.
So for our listeners who are not familiar, yung pinag-uusapan dito is yung historic That's the adjective na
Yeah,
laging
historic.
ginagamit, di ba? Historic,
Landmark.
historic landmark 2015 Paris Agreement kung saan yung mga countries ay nag-agree na ilimit yung emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030 or half
2030.
na by 2030. And then with the bottom-up approach, so yung mga countries yung nag-nationally determine kung ano i-contribute nilang ika-cut down na emissions. So doon pumapasok a whole host of other problems kasi yun nga, hindi siya nagiging ambitious enough to tackle the urgent threat of climate change.
Pero is that always the yung kalakaran in international law? You mentioned international law, even if it's not in the topic of climate change. Ano yung yung flaw or I guess the procedures that happen in international law and bakit siguro mas may urgency when it comes to the climate change topic?
Well, number one, we only have one planet, right? Parang, the debates around international law are debates worthy of having. Like, how do you really... Kasi let's imagine this. International law was really a post-World War project wherein the world envisioned a world where hindi mo pwedeng pakialaman yung mga bansa. And this is to respect their sovereignty, para matapos na yung colonization, para wala ng invasion, occupation. So we will
Very
respect...
ambitious, very ambitious.
Ganon. So parang, because it's a post-World War project where you respect sovereignty, dun nanganak yung inherent flaw na you cannot force a nation to do something without their consent. And even when you get them on board, can you really compel them to do anything? Best example is the International Criminal Court, diba? We ratified the Rome Statute after 11 years kasi nga ang hirap mong isubject yung sarili mo sa isang treaty. But then, even when we were already part of International Criminal Court, did former President Rodrigo Duterte respect it? Of course, he didn't. May nangyari ba? Was he punished? Of course, he wasn't. So, that's the main problem of international law. Ang hirap lang niyang sikmurain because this is climate change. Like, we only have one planet. We literally do not have time to have all these debates.
Sabi mo dun sa paper mo na only the procedures sa climate talks are binding but not the commitments.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate further about that?
Yeah, the researchers have found, again, I go back to for the countries to go on board, dapat satisfied sila sa language of the treaty. So when they see that the treaty's language is so strict that it binds them really, aayaw na yung mga yan sa negotiation. And you must know this, talagang the negotiations over one word, sobrang aabutin sila ng isang buwan para lang sa isang salita.
Right.
So in the end, the product, the 2015 Paris Agreement, was so flexible that the researchers who have reviewed the agreement saw na, in the end, ang legally binding lang is yung procedure for review kung nami-meet ba ng mga country yung kanilang nationally determined contributions
So
or
the process
their
of reviewing.
NDCs. Yes, correct. So it's only the procedure. And even then, even the procedure is so soft and it's so flexible that major emitters like India or China, for example, can find it somehow easy to resist a review. I'll read yung exact language ng Article 13. Sabi doon, the procedure shall be implemented in a facilitative, non-intrusive, non-punitive manner, respectful of national sovereignty, and avoid placing undue burden on parties. So even when there's a mechanism for review, state parties can always say, oh, non-punitive you don't place undue burden on us. So each step of the way, kaya nilang pumalag at sabihin, wait, you can't really force us. And that's why the bottom-up approach has been problematic from the very beginning.
In your paper, you also pointed out na yung kawalan ng penalties, nagiging problem din siya kasi nga, parang kung may free-riding nations o may mga bansa na hindi naman talaga nag-aambag sa pagkat ng emissions, parang wala lang kasi wala namang penalties eh. Pero is that possible na maglagay ng penalties given na ganito nga yung ginagalawan na principles ng international law?
Yun yung mahirap na gagawin. I don't think any state parties will willingly raise their hands up and say, yes, penalize us. No one. So, the suggestions have been a workaround. So, parang mga climate clubs, ganyan. So, parang trans-border penalty. So, for example, you're country A, I'm country B, country C, we form a club. If I see that you're not being green enough, then I'll impose green sanctions on you. So parang, hindi ka makakapag-import sa amin ng ganito if you're not green enough. So it's bilateral relations between nations na mas doable because no one is really, there's no top dictating them what to do. It's really, and we do that on each other, diba? We impose sanctions on each other. That's like how trade works. So the suggestion is baka magtayo na lang ng climate club. Yeah, but as you said nga, yung walang penalty. Sabi ng mga ang tawag nila doon anarchy. Kasi labo eh. I mean, we have had landmark decisions. If you remember yung sa Netherlands, di ba? A civil society group sued their government for not meeting their NDCs. And yet, na-compel ba yung government ng Netherlands? Hindi naman.
Right.
So parang, it's parang ang sakit niyang sikmurain, but it's really how the regime works. And you cannot compel anybody really.
And also, pinoint out mo rin yung problematic about market-based solutions like emissions trading na it gives a lot of wiggle room for free-riding nations.
Yeah.
Parang can you elaborate more on that?
Sure. So yung free riding in the climate change regime, kasi how the atmosphere works, if you do a mitigating effort, minsan it crosses the border. So kung taga-Pilipinas ka and you made an effort, minsan na the result will cross your borders. And so it gives way for countries to free ride. Ibig sabihin, hindi sila yung nagtrabaho, pero sila yung nakinabang kasi umabot sa border nila yung naging resulta ng mitigation efforts ng katabing bansa, karatig bansa, ganun. So, and there's no penalty for free riders. One researcher called the United States the world's most significant free rider. Are they being penalized? Of course not. They're the United States. Tapos yung carbon trading naman, so there's a carbon credit. Like company A, dapat hanggang ganito lang yung emission mo. But you're so green, so you will not use up your carbon credit. I'm company B. I'm such a big polluter. I'll just buy your carbon credit from you. To pollute more. So parang gano'n. So parang there's really as long as you have money, there's really no incentive to save the world. Kasi you can buy. And then I think it was The Guardian who investigated that there are bodies kasi reviewing carbon markets na is this working, ganyan. Tapos The Guardian found that one of the bigger bodies that review carbon markets, they've been reviewing wrongly all along. So sinasabi nilang, this works, pero yun pala, sobrang abuse na ng carbon market. But then again, there's no penalty. So that's why the IPCC said, we have a rapidly closing window to secure a livable future for us.
Pero grabe no, parang if you whittle it down to a few sentences, parang walang penalty. Tapos, pwede ka pang bumili ng credits to pollute more. So, parang, what is all this for?
Kaya ganyan na ganyan yung reaction ko sa klase. Kasi I think when I left the Philippines to go to London, I call myself now a recovering international law addict. Kasi bago ako pumunta doon, I think I saw international law as not the savior, but something we could resort to if domestic. Pero pagdating ko doon, all my teachers, my European teachers, they're so resigned. So parang pag ako sinasabi ko, so what's gonna happen? She says,
so no one has the answer.
Yeah, no one has the answer.
Conversation namin ni Lian nung binrief ko siya about climate change once.
Parang early this year yun.
Early this year.
Kaya parang mabiblame mo ba yung mga nagre-resort sa like theatrics? Kasi diba,
right.
One of the debates around like climate change protests is parang, napaka-performative naman ng protest mo, ganyan-ganyan. But okay, fine, there's a value to
Some
that
groups come
argument.
to mind.
Diba? Pero like, can you blame them? Literally, wala ka nang magawa, and climate change negotiations are so secretive. ang hirap ring to bring it out in the open. So, if theatrics is all you could resort to, and sometimes resulta na rin ng galit mo yun ng frustration mo.
Right. And so let's talk about climate finance, which is, I guess, one of the biggest na pinag-uusapan talaga in these climate talks. Of course, the COP27 was so historic because of the hindi pa nga to establish a fund. It's really just to start the conversation on how to establish that fund. But we all know na meron pang mga earlier pledges yung mga countries na hindi pa nga
Hindi pa
even
nabibigay.
sobrang liit lang nung nasimulan, like less than 10% ata or something. Given that context and also the flaws of international law, parang anong hope for countries like us, like the
Na makakuha
Philippines,
ng funding.
na makakuha ng funding, and how would that even happen?
Can I just say, G? I think it was 2013 or 2012. I interviewed, our program, I was a producer before, we interviewed former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. I think he was doing a world tour kasi kaka-pledge ng mga bansa, like 200 billion by this year. And I remember, sobrang, yung angle pa nung interview na yun na parang, the world coming together to save the world, blah, blah, blah. Nangyari ba yun? Parang hindi naman, 10 years later, has anything happened to that? Nothing happened, so much so that we're back to the drawing board, aka the loss and damage fund. As to your question, so Vanuatu initiated a resolution sa UN na idala sa International Court of Justice yung question of loss and damage fund. Basically, the ICJ is the world court. It handles cases of states versus states. Pero meron silang softer function. They can give advisory opinion. You can see kung paano kalabnaw yung loss and damage. Meron na nga silang loss and damage. Nag-agree na nga yung mga party na, okay, magkakaroon tayo ng loss and damage. Now they have to go to court for an opinion on how it will be done. So parang, mag-agree na kayo. And even if the ICJ answers the question, basically the question is, can you really compel these countries to pay these countries? What would be the international law framework for that? Even if the ICJ gives its advisory opinion, it's non-binding. Hindi siya non-binding. And I know so many cases where the ICJ has rendered an opinion favorable to a country. Hindi rin naman ginagawa ng country na napinalay. So parang, again, anong gagawin natin? So, yun. But I am of the side of the debate where I feel like we've seen the climate change regime develop over time, and we're saying that not much has happened, there's low ambition. I'm on the side of, let's just go public litigation then. Kasi,
what does that mean, Miss Justice?
ibig sabihin parang you use the courts to get something out of these nations. Kasi, international law din is a name and shame game eh. So parang, di naman, you don't want to consent in this. We'll just paint you to the world as a rogue nation, polluter nation. And sometimes countries do the right thing because they're so ashamed to do the bad thing. So name and shame na lang. And I think I am of some people may disagree, but I am of the side where let's just go to court then. Let's just utilize public law to compel these nations. Kung hindi sila kaya ng diplomatic United Nations, the holding hands, paraiso. Let's just go to court. Yun.
Pero historically, ito, medyo parang for my personal, historically, colonial powers, yung mga a lot of free-riding nations ngayon sa konteksto ng climate crisis, they didn't have any problem imposing their agenda on the whole world, which required a lot of resources, of political will. Pero bakit pagdating sa climate crisis, which threatens everybody, and which experts are saying na dapat lutasin because it's the most economical and practical way of doing things for the future. Bakit pagdating sa climate crisis, parang ang lab na, parang walang. Yeah. So, all is soft, non-binding.
Well, colonizers will always act in their own self-interest. Even the United Nations is a colonial product. So, after the war, the allied victors came together and say, oh, let's save the world, let's fix the problems, ganyan. So they drafted the UN Charter, but the colonizers, the empires, the more powerful states, when they saw that the charter was so strong, sabi nila, wait, we can't. Our empire will fall kapag nilakasan natin yung concept ng international law. So the colonizers really said, labnawan natin. So we're not threatened. And I think you could draw a comparison to that in the climate change regime. Kasi sila din yung dehado. I mean, who are the biggest emitters? The colonizers. Like US. And why are they... Tignan mo, there are permanent members of the UN Security Council, like US, UK, France, China, Russia. Ibig sabihin, the colonizers are still reigning supreme. And it's not in their self-interest to reduce their emissions because their economies, they're benefiting from their economy. So we are held hostage by colonial...
By their agenda.
By their agenda again. So parang yun nga, alam mo, hindi ko rin mag-get sa kanila kasi parang hindi ba you are a powerful nation, therefore kayo rin naman yung apektado in the end. I don't also
Parang
know.
Parang nagulaw yung mundo, hindi ba malaking kawalan yun sa kanila kasi they're exploiting the world. So
Exactly. So parang, pero siguro, human nature na kapag hindi naman ikaw yung apektado, hindi mo na-feel yung urgency. So
or they
parang,
could save themselves kasi marami
exactly,
silang resources.
kasi marami silang resources. I mean, punta kayo sa Philippines, parang go to the Philippines and see how people in Tacloban are still reeling from Yolanda 10 years later, diba? Parang, you don't know how it feels to be affected by your actions. Hindi ko rin alam eh.
Pero actually,
Yun yung conclusion
more
ng
recently,
episode
mas
na to.
naramdaman na rin ng mga would you say, developed countries yung climate change. Unti-unti.
Wildfires.
Unti-unti,
yeah.
right?
Wildfires, ganyan. So, kailangan din talaga nilang
Maramdaman.
Maramdaman muna bago sila.
Habang tayo, para mga ilang ano na natin
correct. Pareho na tayo. Yeah.
Correct.
So, Lian, dun sa paper mo, your conclusion really was more of, let's make use of the best, I guess, yung bottom up and top down, the best of those.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate further on that? Like, parang, paano natin siya ngayon matitingnan now that we're going into another cup?
Another cup.
Yeah,
Another
yeah.
cup and another kind of discussion na baka naman hindi natin alam if it will be productive or not. But, yun. Ano yung suggestion mo sa iyong paper?
So, yung kasi, okay, we said that bottom-up is a little problematic, but in some aspects, it's actually what works. Because, kunyari, pag gumawa ka ng efforts in a sitio, isang barangay, you wouldn't want it to be top-down kasi sino bang nakakaalam ng community nila? Eh di, syempre yung mga tao, right. Diba? So you would want that to be bottom-up. You would want the local actors to say what they need, to say what needs to happen. Kasi we also have to take into account that not all mitigation efforts is like economically feasible for a very poor community. Parang ganun. So, kailangan mo rin ng bottom-up approach. But also, isa sa mga labo-labo, dahil nga the mechanism is so flexible. Minsan labo-labo yung method ng mga state parties na parang, okay, my method for computing my emitters is method 1. Pero yung isa, ako method 2. So, wala. So, in that sense, baka pwedeng top-down approach. Baka pwedeng sabihin ng nasa taas na, uniform method tayo one method, one format. Para when we monitor all of you, isa lang yung titignan natin. Kasi kung iba-ibang method, ang hirap din namang to, maningil ng mga bansa.
So speaking of the COP28, dahil si
dahil pupunta siya sa Dubai.
Dahil siya ang pumunta sa Dubai for the Rappler coverage of COP28, parang pageant question. What are your hopes na sa COP28? Gusto mo makakita ng ganung redesign, bottom-up and top-down approach?
I don't think parang masyado ng close na para magkaroon ng redesign. But, they're looking at this COP kasi medyo, this is the COP where they're going to do another global stocktake. Mm-hmm. The last one was in Paris, nung Paris pa. So, medyo all eyes are on Dubai. Yeah. And especially, syempre, well, to begin with, Dubai yung mag-host. Mm-hmm. Just the choice of who will be host. Well, it's not a choice. Pero, sila yung COP president. Mm-hmm. And ano yung mga maiko-commit again in the ano. So, my hope, I'm going into this, siguro dahil I've observed enough COP talks to know na hindi, kung magkaroon man ng any progress, it won't be as, hindi siya magiging sobrang significant or like hindi siya groundbreaking. Kahit malagyan pa nila ng historic landmark, ganyan. Kasi
Kahit ano pa, adject pa yung ilagay natin dyan sa headline.
when they announce the final paper,
Yeah.
the final So we know that so much has to be done. And kahit locally pa lang, Pilipinas pa lang, the funding, on adaptation, mitigation, all those things, ang dami pa natin kailangang makita na gawin ng mga developed countries. So, I am going into it, kasi sabi naman nila, with climate change, dapat you're always hopeful. So,
Which
parang,
is nakakapagod, ah.
well,
Kasi wala kang
what can you
choice.
do, di
Yeah,
ba?
what can you do?
Parang, magiging, ano ka lang, paparalyze ka lang if you become afraid of, all those gloom and doom. Pero, what I'm excited about, I guess, is yung covering the communities that are presenting their solutions local. And ganun, that's how I want to approach it also, my coverage. Na parang, all those talks will be covered by so many, media. And I think, maging well-covered yan. But it's the solutions from the communities na minsan hindi talaga naka-highlight. In this COP, ina-expect din that there will be a summit of local leaders, so mga cities. And actually, the cities they also have their own, diba? They have their own solutions na I think worth looking into. And I na-appreciate ko na meron na may summit. And I think the last one was also in Paris. So yun, parang it's it's
Mix ng hope and doom and
yes, parang it's really the hope when it comes to climate change, at least covering the climate change. It's really the communities that really bring the solutions that you want to look for. Kahit na alam mo yun, parang itong mga bansa, they are the ones who will move the needle talaga. Talagang sila, yung the bigger countries, sila yung mas
And
may
their agenda,
power and mas may. Pero as long as matagal pa yung matagal pa yung discussion na yun, that's how I want to see this next climate change.
How about you, Lian? Kasi parang naalala ko, bago ka, nung paalis ka na ng UK, tapos naalala ko yung mga messages mo sa Telegram ng reporters, parang paulit-ulit ka, international law is a fantasy.
It is a fantasy.
So given na
It
it is a fantasy, tapos dun nakasangkla yung climate action, parang what hope do we have then? May mangyayari.
International is a fantasy, but I also believe in fantasies. Na parang, I think there's
quote right there.
there's a value in believing in fantasies. I mean, who could have thought we can beat China, 'di ba, sa Permanent Court of Arbitration? Parang wala namang nag-aakalang we can do it, but yet we did it. So that was a fantasy. And that was a fantasy came true. So parang I'm a sucker for small countries making dreams come true. So actually, now that I'm back and as a recovering international law addict, parang I'd focus like my watch on the players rather than the framework. So I would want to see how the Philippines can, assert its ground. Kasi if we're gonna name and shame, if that's really the only resort, would Philippines join? Or would Philippines be as diplomatic as before? Like for example, nung Vanuatu wanted the resolution na let's go to court, let's go to ICJ, Philippines was among those who supported it. Among those who expressed reservation, they didn't want to go to court, again, was the US because we know why. And President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has now renewed close ties with the US. So it's kind of interesting, in the climate change regime, does he stay chummy-chummy with the US interests? Or will he say, you know what, sobrang kawawa ng mga Pilipino. We need to be a louder voice in these negotiations. So I'm looking at the players. If it's a fantasy, how far can we go to make this fantasy come true?
And speaking of Marcos, interesting nga to watch what he'll say kasi marami talaga siyang rhetorics on climate change.
Right.
So,
And there are, may balita na pupunta siya this
Oh,
COP na
okay.
thing. So, hindi pa confirmed,
Something.
pero yun yung balita. So, we'll see kung haharap na siya sa climate talks.
we'll see.
We'll see.
But definitely, even just the delegation, it will be led by Secretary Tony Loizaga. So,
Gumana sa akin.
Loizaga, your secretary.
Your
My secretary.
And who will be in that delegation, who will lead, ano yung mga positions that the Philippines will take. That will determine how strong our voice will be. And if you remember, nung COP28, Philippines was really a leader in these talks. So, whether that will be, there will be a repeat of that in this COP28, we will see.
Right. So I hope our listeners get a little bit of hope. Kahit na ang diniscuss natin dito ay dismal state or whatever of that international law is a fantasy. That's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any story ideas, tag us on Twitter at Gozum and at Geronimo. See you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye!